The gospel lessons for each day of Holy Week lift up things that Jesus said and did in Jerusalem after his triumphal entry into the city on Palm Sunday. Things that communicated the nature of what kind of Messiah he would be, which turned out to be very different from what most people had come to expect of the Messiah. On Monday of Holy Week, we hear about Mary of Bethany, the sister of Lazarus, who anoints Jesus' head with a bottle of costly nard. She crosses social boundaries of every kind in touching him so publicly and so intimately, as if he were her husband or a brother or a son. And she pours out this bottle of nard on his head that's equal to a year's worth of wages. Jesus could have easily rebuked her for her wastefulness and for her social transgression, and everyone would have nodded their approval. But he didn't. Instead, he praised her for this extravagant expression of love that she clearly felt was worth the risk of offense and even punishment. On Tuesday of Holy Week, today, in John chapter 12, we hear that some Greeks who were there in Jerusalem for the Passover celebration approach one of the disciples, telling him, "Sir, we wish to see Jesus." To understand what happens next, it helps to know that in John's gospel, seeing is akin to believing, to understanding. So when these Greeks say they want to see Jesus, they're not saying, "We'd like an appointment to meet him," so much as, "Help us understand him. Help us come to believe." They've clearly heard people talking about Jesus. There had been quite a buzz stirred up about him in those days just before he had come up to Jerusalem. They'd heard he actually raised a man from the dead. This was Lazarus, of course, the brother of Mary, who had anointed his head with nard. And that miracle of raising a man from death is likely what inspired the people to come out in droves that Sunday as Jesus came up into the city to hail him as the Messiah, throwing cloaks and palms down on the streets before him. But his behavior in Jerusalem had been puzzling. Not exactly what they had expected of the Messiah, who was to be King of Kings and Lord of Lords, our great high priest, righteous and holy above all. For one, Jesus had ridden in through the adoring crowds, not on a white stallion, but on a donkey, and a borrowed one at that. And then he'd allowed this clear transgression of good order, letting the woman with the nard touch him so intimately in public, this man who was neither her husband, nor her brother, nor her son. So the Greeks are asking the disciples, "Help us understand. How can he be the Messiah? There's clearly something godly about him. He's raised a man from the dead, but he's not acting much like a king, and he's not very priest-like either. How can he be the Messiah?" When the disciples convey the Greeks' request to Jesus, "Help us see this Jesus, help us understand," Jesus replies in another puzzling way. First he says, "The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified." And you can imagine them thinking, "All right, now that's what I'm talking about. Glorification, assuming the throne, driving out these Romans, getting back to business as a holy nation. Now we're talking." But then Jesus describes what that glorification looks like. He says, "Unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains just a single grain. But if it dies, it bears much fruit." And again, I imagine he leaves them puzzled. I encourage you to take a moment today to read this passage. There's a link to it on our webpage under Holy Week Worship, and there's a link to it in the comments section below on this YouTube video. It's clear from Jesus' response to the Greeks' inquiry that if we want to understand the essence of how Jesus is the Messiah, of how it is he saves us, we have to embrace his willingness to die for love of us. In our liturgies throughout the year and at Holy Week, we call him mighty and glorious. We sing of his majesty. But his majesty doesn't come from his ability to force, to make things happen here on earth as they do in heaven. His majesty is tied up in the power of vulnerability and of sacrificial love. To understand that love, not just in one's mind, but in one's being, is to be changed by it. It's to be remade and reshaped into a person more like him. That is how he saves us. Jesus isn't a Hollywood kind of hero. He doesn't save us by suddenly jumping down off the cross and raising an army to drive out the Romans. And he doesn't take us down from our crosses either. He saves us not by rescuing us from the crosses that we must bear, but by climbing up onto them with us and showing us the power of love to change the world. Amen.